A story about a small town charity. A new chairman was elected, and he was going through all the records as it came time for the annual charity drive, and he saw where one of the richest men in town had never given a penny. So he went to see him, and he said that he'd been going through the records, and he said the records show that you have never given anything to the annual town charity. And the man said, well, do the records also show that I had a brother who was permanently injured as a result of a wound in World War II and is unable to work or take care of himself? Do they show that my sister was widowed with 7 children left and no insurance and no means of support? Well, the chairman, a little abashed, said, well, no, our records don't show that. Well, he said, I don't give them anything. Why should I give something to you?
Good morning. It is Thursday, March the 16th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have America the Beautiful, No Free Lunch, Ronald Reagan, Don't Think of an Elephant, Covert Manipulation, The Rape of the Mind, Donald Trump, and some personal commentary. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts without any regard either to the great interest or to the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principal emotion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislator might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, The game will go on miserably, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder. Adam Smith. There is nothing I could say to improve on this mastery.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, in about a minute and a half of Donald Trump.
In my mind, anybody running for the office of President of the United States should agree to take a full and complete mental competency test simultaneously or before with the announcement that he or she is running, and likewise, but to a somewhat lesser extent, agree to a test which would prove that you are physically capable of doing the job as president. Being an outstanding president requires great mental acuity and physical stamina and strength. If you don't have these qualities or traits, it is likely that you will not succeed and you will disappoint the entire world, let alone our own country. We need to make America great again. Take a competency test. Let's see whether or not these people that are running for office are competent. I took the test 2 years ago, and I aced it. And I'd love to take it again because I think I'd even do better. Somebody running for president where 350 million people are relying on you. They're relying on your brain. They're relying on your competence. I think taking a competency test would be a good thing.
And that was Donald Trump about taking a mental competency test, or believes it should be a requirement for all people running for president. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the next 3 of the 30 covert emotional manipulation tactics.
10. Guilt. A skilled manipulator can make you feel incredibly guilty for not doing something they want you to do. Your conscience and your desire to be a good person can be used to control you. They can make you lose sight of the fact that you don't want to do what the manipulator wants you to do, but you've been made to feel that you should do it. Many of us are conditioned to feel guilt by our family, religion, and society, so it is easy for manipulators to make us feel it too. Being able to feel guilt means we have a conscience. It's not a bad thing, except when it's exploited. Guilt is a negative emotion, experienced when we believe we have harmed someone, or when something we've done or failed to do made someone think poorly of us. Our natural reaction is to apologize, make amends, and act in a way that will make the other person think highly of us again, which means acting in the way that person wants us to act. Guilt is closely related to shame and anxiety. It is an uncomfortable emotion, so we are highly motivated to avoid it. We evade the torment of guilt by behaving the way others expect us to. Manipulators know this all too well and use it to their advantage. The following are examples of statements that can send us on a guilt trip. I can't believe you would even think that I would lie to you. How can you feel that way after all I've done for you? Don't worry. I guess I'll manage somehow if you won't help me out. If you really loved me, you would blank. Fill in the blank with anything a manipulator wants you to do that you do not want to do. 11. Shame. We feel shame when someone communicates to us that we are not worthy of respect. A manipulator makes a victim feel shame by expressing disgust or disappointment, using sarcasm or put-downs, or comparing us to someone else they claim to think is better in some way. Shame is a very powerful tool for a manipulator. Few emotional states are more painful than shame. We feel guilty for what we do, But we feel shame for what we are. Shame is a feeling of deep humiliation, and some manipulators enjoy making their victim feel humiliated. It places them in a superior position. According to clinical psychologist Gershon Kaufman, shame is the most disturbing experience individuals ever have about themselves. No other emotion feels more deeply disturbing, because in the moment of shame, the self feels wounded from within. In relationships, we feel shame from anything we say or do that we believe weakens the bond or causes rejection. Many of the manipulation tactics described here accomplish one or both of those. Shame can turn into the pervasive belief that you are in some way inherently defective or unacceptable. So this manipulation tactic can cause serious psychological harm. Your sense of self-worth will suffer, and that will have a negative effect on all aspects of your life. 12. Empty words. The basic tool for the manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. Philip K. Dick. Manipulators are liars who think nothing of making a promise or commitment they have no intention of keeping. They are also consummate seducers who can turn on the charm and tell you exactly what you want to hear. I love you. You're so special to me. I don't know how I got so lucky. I've waited my whole life for you. When a manipulator utters these words, they are backed up by nothing. But you may not notice that his or her actions are telling a very different story. Using empty words to fulfill your need for approval, love, validation, admiration, appreciation, or reassurance gives a manipulator incredible power over you. They tell you what you want to hear in order to get what they want. Always remember, actions speak louder than words.
And that was numbers 10, 11, and 12 of the 30 Covert Emotional Manipulation Tactics. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, about 6 minutes of the rape of the mind, the search for ecstasy through drugs.
The search for ecstasy through drugs. Among drug addicts of all sorts, we repeatedly encounter the yearning for a special ecstatic and euphoric mood, a feeling of living beyond everyday troubles. Thou hast the keys of paradise, O just, subtle, and mighty opium, Thomas de Quincey says in his Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Although the ecstatic state is different for each person who experiences it, the addict always tells us that the drug takes him to the lost paradise he is looking for. It brings him a feeling of eternal euphoria and free elation that takes him past the restrictions of life and time. In the ecstatic state, man rearranges the universe according to his own desires, and at the same time seeks communion with the higher order of things. But the ecstatic state has its negative as well as its positive aspects. It may represent the yogi's mystic feeling of unity with the universe, but it may also mean the chronic intoxicated state of the drunkard or the passion of some manic psychotic states. The feeling may express the intensified spiritual experience of a dedicated study group, but on the other hand, it may be encountered in the lynch mob and the riot. There are many kinds of ecstasy: aesthetic ecstasy, mystic ecstasy, and sick, toxic ecstasy. The search for ecstatic experiences is not only an individual search, it often reaches out to encompass whole groups. When moral controls become too burdensome, whole civilizations may give themselves up to uncontrolled orgies, such as we saw in the Greek bacchanalia and the contagious dance fury of the Middle Ages. In these mass orgies, artificial stimulants are not necessarily used. The hypnotic influence of being part of the crowd can induce the same loss of control and sense of union with the outside world that we associate with drugs. In the mass orgy, the individual loses his conscience and self-control. His sexual inhibitions may disappear. he is temporarily relieved of his deep frustrations and the burden of unconscious guilt. He endeavors to re-experience the blissful sensations of infancy, the utter yielding to his own body needs and desires. The ecstatic participation in mass elation is the oldest psychodrama in the world. Taking part in some common action results in a tremendous emotional relief and catharsis for every individual in the group. This feeling of participation in the magic omnipotent group, of reunion and communion with the all-embracing forces in the world, brings euphoria to the normal person and feelings of pseudo-strength to the weak. The demagogue who is able to provide such ecstatic release in the masses can be sure of their yielding to his influence and power. Dictators love to organize such mass rituals in service of their dictatorial aims. Ever since man has been a conscious being, he has tried from time to time to break down the inevitable tension between himself and the outside world. When mental alertness cannot be relaxed now and then, when the world is too much and too constantly with him, man may try to lose himself in the deep waters of oblivion. Ecstasy, drugged sleep, and its fantasies and swoons of mental exaltation temporarily take him beyond the burdensome effort of keeping his senses and ego alert and intact. Drugs can bring him to this state, and any addiction may be explained as a continuing need to escape. The body cooperates with the mind in this search for an evasion of life, and drugs gradually become a body need as well as an emotional necessity. In criminal circles, addicting drugs like cocaine or heroin are often given to members of the gang in order to make them more submissive to the leader who distributes them. The man who provides the drug becomes almost a god to the members of the gang. They will go through hell for him in order to acquire the drug they so desperately need. In the hands of a powerful tyrant, this medication into dependency can become extremely dangerous. It is not unthinkable that a diabolical dictator might want to use addiction as a means of bringing a rebellious people into submission. In May 1954, during a discussion in the World Health Organization, the fact was disclosed that Communist China, while forbidding the use of opium in her own country, was smuggling and exporting it in great quantities to her neighbors, who have consequently been compelled to carry on a constant struggle against opium addiction among their own people and against the passivity which results from the use of the drug. At the same time, according to officials of Thailand who made the charge and who requested UN aid, Communist China has been sending all kinds of subversive propagandists into Thailand. Thailand charged that the Chinese were using every device they know to infect the Siamese people with their ideology, brain-weakening opium addiction, leaflets, radio, whispering campaigns, and so on. The Nazis followed a similar strategy. During the occupation of Western Europe, they created an artificial shortage of human medicaments by halting their usual export of healing drugs to the inferior countries. However, they made an exception in the case of barbiturates. In Holland, for example, these drugs were readily available in many drugstores without doctors' prescriptions, a situation which was against customary Dutch law. Although the right therapeutic drugs were not made available for medical work, the drugs which created passivity, dependence, and lethargy were widely distributed. The totalitarian dictator knows that drugs can be his helpers. It was Hitler's intention in his so-called biological warfare to weaken and subdue the countries that surrounded the Third Reich, and to break the backbones for good. Hunger and addiction were among his most valuable strategic tools. What has all this to do with the growing addiction and alcoholism in our own country? I have already mentioned the alarming increases in death from barbiturates, but I would like to emphasize even more the psychological and political consequences. Democracy and freedom end where slavery and submission to drugs and alcohol begin. Democracy involves free, self-chosen activity and understanding. It means mature self-control and independence. Any man who escapes from reality through the use of alcohol and drugs is no longer a free agent. He is no longer able to exert any voluntary control over his mind and his actions. He is no longer a self-responsible individual. Alcoholism and drug addiction prepare the pattern of mental submission so beloved by the totalitarian brainwasher. Hypnotism and mental coercion.
And that was the Rape of the Mind, and that was, let me see if we can hear, The Search for Ecstasy Through Drugs. And it's a fascinating piece, and again, about how, and I like the way that he applies this to politics, to dictators and totalitarians, and how they can put drug addiction to good use, so to speak. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the remainder of Chapter 5, about 15 minutes, of Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate by Dr. George-Lakoff.
That is why we can be deeply moved by a novel or a movie or even a newspaper story. Neuroscientists have also shown that when someone is in love and they see their loved one in pain, the pain center in their own brain is activated. Emotional pain is real. Sounds simple, but there are some twists to the story, some neural complications that affect how we ultimately respond to what we see, hear, and imagine. The prefrontal cortex has regions particularly active during the exercise of judgment. These regions contain neurons that are active when we are performing some particular action and less active when we see someone else performing the same action. It is hypothesized that this gives us the capacity to modulate our empathy, to lessen it or turn it off in certain cases. The mirror neuron system thus connects us emotionally to others, but can in certain cases also distance us emotionally from others. The prefrontal cortex is active in another neural system too, one that I'll call the well-being, ill-being system. This is the system that releases certain hormones in your brain when you have experiences that make you feel good, and releases others when experiences make you feel bad. In essence, this system regulates whether you have a sense of well-being or ill-being at any given time. It is also the system that presumably is involved in making judgments on the basis of your imagination of what will or won't bring you well-being. The well-being system and the empathy system can interact in complex ways. Some people feel satisfaction both when they are personally satisfied and when those they empathize with feel a sense of well-being. Other people do not have the two systems connected in that way. 1. They have the well-being system overriding the empathy system, with their interests overriding the cares and interests of others. Or, 2, they can have a complex interaction in which they maintain their own well-being and balance it with contributing to the well-being of others. Or 3, they may be self-sacrificing, always placing the well-being of others ahead of their own well-being. Or 4, they may be part of an in-group and may place their well-being and that of the in-group members first, without empathizing at all with out-group members. This can vary depending on what counts as a given person's in-group. Since morality is about well-being, your own and that of others, these 4 alternatives define different moral attitudes. Can the mirror neuron system be affected by inborn factors? Apparently, yes. With certain forms of autism, empathy is lessened or largely absent. In psychopaths, empathy is controlled. Psychopaths can sense what someone else is feeling, not be affected themselves, and then manipulate the other for their own benefit or enjoyment. Can the mirror system be affected by how one is raised, by one's family life and peer relations? Does one's political morality correlate with one's capacity for empathy? That is, with the operation of the mirror neuron and well-being systems. That is being investigated, and preliminary results suggest there is a difference between extreme progressives and extreme conservatives, with extreme conservatives showing less activation in their empathy system. Since all thoughts and feelings are physical, a matter of brain circuitry, it is not surprising that moral sensibilities should be constituted by physical brain structures like those we have just been discussing. These brain structures form the neural basis not only of your own moral sensibilities, but also your views on what an ideal person ought to be. The ideal person. What should an ideal person be like?
Conservatives and progressives have largely opposite views, given their different views of morality. Biconceptuals have different views as well, depending on how their moral views are divided up. Biconceptuals who are largely conservative will tend to have a conservative view of what people should be like, and biconceptuals who are largely progressive will tend to have a progressive view of what people should be like. Or biconceptuals that are less extreme may believe that an ideal person is biconceptual in the same way they are, with the same distribution of conservative and progressive views. The progressive, nurture-and-parent moral system maintains a delicate balance between the empathy and the personal well-being systems. At its core is empathy for others and the responsibility to act on that empathy, but it is modulated by the proviso that you can't take care of anyone else if you're not taking care of yourself. That is, it centers on empathy and includes both personal and social responsibility. The conservative moral system centers on the well-being system, on personal responsibility alone, on serving your own interests without depending on the empathy of others to take care of you and without having empathy and responsibility for others. There are nuances, but this gets at the heart of the difference. Empathy versus sympathy. Empathy and sympathy both involve the capacity to know what others are feeling. But unlike empathy, sympathy involves distancing, overriding personal emotional feeling. Someone who is sympathetic may well act to relieve the pain of others, but not feel the pain themselves. The word compassion can be used for either empathy or sympathy, depending on who is using the word. For example, George W. Bush, in first announcing his run for the presidency, called himself a compassionate conservative, citing the book by Marvin Olasky, The Tragedy of American Compassion. Olasky and Bush's take on compassion and conservatism point to a central difference between progressives and conservatives. Progressives tend to believe that society as a whole has a responsibility to aid those in real material need, and that the government should be a major instrument, with support from taxes. Conservatives tend to prefer charity, delivered through non-governmental organizations, and tend to believe that real help for most people in material need is a refusal of aid, to give them an incentive to help themselves. Hence the conservative motto, "It is better to teach someone to fish than to give him a fish to eat." Incidentally, charity for the deserving few costs a lot less than taxes to provide resources for the benefit of all. This dichotomy leads to two very different ideas of what an ideal person should be like, and how our politics should be arranged to produce a version of the ideal person with the right moral system, whether purely conservative, purely progressive, or the right combination of the two. Reflexivity and personhood. At this point, we have to ask the reflexivity question for personhood. Can linguistic framing change the kind of person someone is? The answer seems to be yes, though possibly not in extreme cases. And of course, it may depend on age and circumstances, but such changes do appear to have happened over the years, so far as I can tell, mostly with biconceptuals. Extreme conservatives, estimated at about 25 to 30% of the U.S. population, it appears, cannot be changed by reframing and setting up an effective communication system that operates full-time, not just at elections. Yes, this means that some people cannot be reached, an inaccurate progressive metaphor, or woken up, another inaccurate progressive metaphor. Consider the moderate progressive who is partly conservative. She hears conservative language and conservative arguments over and over, day after day, for years, in the media or with friends or both. The conservative language will activate the conservative moral system, making it a bit stronger every time the language is heard. As the conservative circuitry in her brain becomes stronger, the synapses strengthen, the more likely it is that her views on issues will change from progressive to conservative. The result may be a shift within the brain from a person who is partly conservative to a person who is mostly conservative. I believe this has actually happened in many cases. That is the power of the conservative messaging system. It is reflexivity in action. Over time, someone's very personhood can change, and with it her ideal of what other people should be, and of course who they should vote for. The other conservative use of reflexivity depends on getting those votes. Once in office, conservatives can not only say that government cannot work and has to be minimized and privatized, but by being in the government, they can also stop it from working, thus creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. How? By cutting taxes, by cutting funding, by passing laws, and in the Supreme Court by reinterpreting laws. In contemporary America, politics and personhood are inseparable, and apparently moving in a conservative direction. To change that direction, progressives need to understand the role of the brain and of communication systems in the process. Politics and personhood at the founding. When the United States was founded, politics and personhood had come together, but in the progressive direction. Historian Lynn Hunt at UCLA goes through the history in detail in her book, Inventing Human Rights, A History. She starts with the defining passage of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If these rights are self-evident, she asks, why does Jefferson have to say that they are self-evident? And when did they become self-evident? Hunt, a former president of the American Historical Society, studied the writing and culture of France, England, and the 13 colonies. She shows that those ideas were not there in the 1600s and came into existence in the mid-1700s, mainly after 1760. When Western Europe and the States were swept up in a major cultural change. That change can be seen in the period's novels like Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Julie, the biggest bestseller of the century with 70 editions between 1761 and 1800. Julie was written as a collection of intimate letters between two lovers. Readers identified deeply with the emotional lives of the characters, whose psychological states were revealed and developed from letter to letter, arousing empathy for the plights of ordinary people. Between 1760 and the 1780s, such novels multiplied. Laws were passed ending torture by the state as being inhuman. Portraits showing the individual characteristics of their subjects started to be painted. Manners changed to increase personal control over one's body. For example, blowing your nose into a handkerchief. And the idea of individual autonomy came into existence in a rush. These changes were propelled by empathy, by identification with the problems and plights of ordinary people, feeling what the characters felt, seeing such plight around them, and propelling legal and governmental change. By 1776, human rights became self-evident via the development of empathy for one's fellow citizens. Such empathy formed the basis for a union of states, the American democracy. Historian Danielle Allen of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton has taken the study of the Declaration of Independence one important step further in Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality. It is a thorough reading of the Declaration, though the central passage again is the classic one on self-evident truths. But Allen, going through the original copies, argues that the period at the end of that passage was not there in the original document. It was inserted later. Her case is backed up by the grammar of what follows. Here is the passage as a whole with the original punctuation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Allen argues that with the period, the self-evident truths end with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what I've described above as coming from the well-being system, but lacking the idea of citizens establishing and working through a government on the basis of empathy and for the well-being of all. The passage ending with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is about freedom, but what follows is about equality, with the central role of the government to secure it. The grammar, the succession of that clauses and the plural, to affect their safety and happiness, shows that the passage goes beyond the pursuit of happiness to the role of government in guaranteeing equality in the unalienable rights. Allen is right that this is a big deal. Her point is not just about a period. It is about our political division. As I describe in my book, Whose Freedom?, progressives and conservatives have very different views of freedom. Conservatives talk about their version of freedom, which does not include either equality or the role of government in securing it. They also attribute their view to the Founding Fathers. And though conservatives seek radical change, they use the term conservative as if it conserved the values of the founding of our nation. At issue is what freedom is supposed to mean, what democracy is supposed to mean, and what personhood is supposed to be.
And that was Chapter 5 of the book, Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate, by Dr. George-Lakoff. And I will have some commentary on this later. Back in a minute. Thank you. And so I've got some comments about what Dr. Lakoff was talking about. And one of the things was, it's so rich what he has to say. It's really worth listening to, and it's really worth listening to, or if you're going to get the book and read it and reread it several times, because it's fascinating, because it's an insight into the way that, if not progressives think, then the way Dr. Lakoff wants them to think, certainly. One of the things that's in his little spiel today was determinism. That seems to be the major overarching theme, was that people don't do anything for their own reasons. They have no free will, so therefore they don't have their own personal reasons. They do not come to their own conclusions. They don't make decisions. They're forced to do what they do by powers beyond their control. One of the things he was talking about was conservatives versus progressives with Bush and the compassion situation, and that somehow also, by the way, that the whole idea of conservatives versus progressives is a canard, that just because you're progressive, some of the biggest people that are most conservatory are progressives, and some of the most progressive people that we've ever had are conservative. So conservatism and progressivism aren't automatically at odds with one another. They're not repugnant. They may be repugnant or contradictory. They may be at times contrary, but they're not contradictory. Another thing is that he talked again about George Bush and the getting his ideas from Olasky is the name of the guy that wrote a book, and I remember this when I was watching C-SPAN a lot back in the late 80s and early 90s, that Olasky wrote this book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, and that, number one, that the places that you go for if you're homeless and whatnot are very often not Christian-centered. They're not. They don't have a religious center to them. The other thing is that anybody can go in. I think he actually went into some of these places and stayed, and you can stay for as long as you want. There's no requirement for you to actually do anything. There's no requirement for you to rehabilitate yourself. To go out, get a job, and get off the dole, so to speak, and become and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or otherwise make personal progress towards getting away from the need to be assisted. So you can. It's just another way of where you're still dependent. As a matter of fact, it turns compassion on its head and goes from making you the idea of compassion making you independent once more to making sure you stay dependent. But so anyway, so he's pointing that out, and George Bush that's where he got his idea of being the compassionate conservative, supposedly. And I know that George Bush had touted that book many times. But anyways, then Dr. Lakoff goes on to talk about fish. He says fish rather than eat, to eat fish. And that's not the quote. The quote is, if you give a man a fish, he eats today. If you teach him to fish, he eats every day. And then the point of that is, which is more compassionate, giving them the fish or teaching them to fish? And again, it goes back to the issue of independence. What is better, to be dependent or to be independent? Also, he talks about the government, and then there's supposed to be the idea of taxes and using taxes to make sure that there's equality. There's nothing in the Constitution that provides for that. The money that we are supposed to be paying in taxes is to run the government, to run the federal government, for instance, but state and local as well, of course. But keeping the conversation on the federal government, the federal government's powers are limited. We read that in the Constitution. The government has no rights. It has authority, limited, and it has responsibilities, also limited. And that's what we're paying for. That's what why we're paying taxes, so that the government can have a Treasury Department, a Defense Department, an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch. Okay, so that it can carry out its functions. The purpose of paying taxes is not to be so that we can. What is it that the left refers to when you're taking money away from one person and you're giving it to another? Income redistribution. Because basically that's what he's talking about. He just doesn't use the phrase income redistribution. But that's basically what he's talking about when he says that the government taxes for all. No, it's government taxes to run the government. And then each individual person, taxpayer, whatever, they make their own arrangements. They are independent people. Now, he believes, again, that there is no independence, that there's no merit, and that people are forced to do what they do by powers beyond their control. And one of the things is he was citing the Declaration of Independence, and he was using this as a deterministic power, that it is coming right down to where they put the period. You put the period in one place, it forces people to think one way. You put the period in another place, it forces people to think another way. And so supposedly the only reason we have conservatives in this country is because of a misplaced period. He ignores the fact that that conservatism comes from 2,000 years of intellectual history. Conservatism goes all the way back to Aristotle. And then there is along the way St. Thomas Aquinas, John Locke, and others. But that there's a whole history of thought. With him, everything starts and ends at the Declaration of Independence. Or he also talks about a book that was written by Rousseau, some novel. And apparently this novel is what it is that forced people to think differently than they used to think. He doesn't exactly describe how this works and how it is that these folks they must have been forced to read it, but who forced them to do it again, he doesn't say. Who forced them to read this book that forced them to change their minds or forced them to start acting in a different way? He doesn't say. What happens in reality is you make the presumption of the status quo and you do things the same way until there is a prima facie case for change. When you're presented with a prima facie case for change, you do things differently. Whether that prima facie case comes from a book, a movie, a radio program, whatever it happens to be. But when you're presented with a prima facie case that there is a better way to do things, and he also seems to forget that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were written in response to a form of government that was known as a monarchy, and that it was specifically written in opposition to monarchy. It was a document that said, we don't need kings, queens, aristocracies. We don't need them. Each individual person can think for themselves and do at least as well thinking and acting on their own as anybody who lives under the aegis, if you will, of some sort of a monarch, a king or a queen. So, again, very deterministic, and again, very insightful in terms of giving you an idea of exactly the level at which the liberals are operating, what the way they're thinking. It's getting to like a subconscious level, where they're trying to be manipulative. So, and that's a good excuse for them. Determinism is an excellent excuse for them to be manipulative. Back in a minute.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for shining, shining sea. Oh, beautiful nature tree that sees beyond the years. Thine alabaster cities gleam, undid by humanity. God shed His grace, His grace on me, and crown my good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea, and crown my good with brotherhood. From sea to shining
This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So I'm reminding you that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.